And I was on the movie for about 2 months. And so it was really a super, super experience. I heard this big voice boom out, "Don't let that little girl's face get in the camera." And I said, uh-oh, what did I do?
You think you know the Ten Commandments as Cecil B. DeMille's biblical masterpiece where Charlton Heston parts the Red Sea. But the real miracle was that anyone survived making this colossal epic. Behind the divine spectacle and massive sets was a dying director gambling everything on one final vision.
Hear, O Israel!
Actors nearly killed by desert conditions, and Hollywood's most expensive production risking Paramount's entire future. What you're about to discover will astound you. A tyrant director hiding heart disease while commanding thousands, rivalries between Moses and Pharaoh that extended far beyond the script, and revolutionary special effects that still inspire wonder decades later.
Behold his mighty hand!
The plagues were movie magic, but the suffering in the Egyptian desert was devastatingly real. Cecil B. DeMille, director-producer, Cecil B. DeMille's decision to remake his own 1923 silent version of the Ten Commandments as his final film represented the ultimate act of ego and artistic conviction. At 75 years old, he was gambling his legacy and Paramount's financial stability on proving that biblical epics could still dominate modern cinema in the age of television and contemporary realism. DeMille's tyrannical control on set became legendary, treating cast and crew like subjects in his personal kingdom. He communicated directions through a microphone system that broadcast his commands across the massive sets, creating an atmosphere of constant surveillance and intimidation. His temper was volcanic, and he would publicly humiliate anyone who questioned his vision or made mistakes. The shocking secret was that DeMille was seriously ill throughout production, having suffered a heart attack before filming began. He hid his condition from the studio and most of the cast, directing while in constant pain and at genuine risk of dying on set. His determination to complete this final testament to his religious convictions kept him working despite medical advice to retire. Charlton Heston. Moses Charlton Heston's casting as Moses represented destiny meeting preparation, as the actor's distinctive features, commanding voice, and physical presence seemed divinely designed for portraying the biblical prophet. DeMille saw something almost supernatural in Heston's ability to embody ancient authority and moral conviction without appearing theatrical or artificial. Heston's physical transformation was extensive and genuine. He grew his own beard for the role, spending months developing the weathered appearance of a man who had spent 40 years in the wilderness. His dedication to authenticity extended to studying biblical texts, historical accounts, and archaeological evidence about ancient Hebrew culture and Egyptian court life. The mentor-student relationship between DeMille and Heston proved crucial to the film's success. DeMille guided Heston through every nuance of performance, teaching him to project divine authority without arrogance and to embody spiritual conviction without religious sentimentality. This partnership created a Moses that felt both human and touched by God. Yul Brynner, Ramesses II. Yul Brynner's distinctive baldness became one of cinema's most fortuitous physical characteristics, making him the perfect visual embodiment of an Egyptian pharaoh whose arrogance matched his regal bearing. His exotic appearance and theatrical background gave Ramesses a magnetic presence that threatened to overshadow Heston's more restrained Moses. The rivalry between Brynner and Heston extended beyond their characters' biblical conflict into genuine competitive tension on set. Brynner believed his Ramesses was the more interesting character and worked to steal every scene they shared, using dramatic gestures and vocal inflections that contrasted with Heston's understated approach. This competition created authentic antagonism that served the story perfectly. Brynner's research into Egyptian history and archaeology was surprisingly thorough for an actor known more for presence than preparation. He studied pharaonic art, read scholarly works on ancient Egyptian culture, and consulted with Egyptologists to understand how royal authority would have been expressed through gesture, posture, and speech patterns in the ancient world. Anne Baxter and Yvonne de Carlo. Anne Baxter's portrayal of Nefertiti transformed the Egyptian queen into a femme fatale whose sexual desire and political ambition drove much of the film's interpersonal drama. Baxter brought sophisticated sensuality to a role that could have been merely decorative. creating a woman whose intelligence matched her beauty and whose frustrated love for Moses motivated her cruelty. Yvonne Carlo's casting as Sephora, Moses' wife, seemed almost absurdly against type for an actress later famous as Lily Munster. Her transformation from Hollywood glamour girl to modest biblical spouse required suppressing her natural vivacity and sex appeal to embody the virtuous shepherd's daughter who represented a moral purity and domestic devotion. The limited female roles reflected 1950s Hollywood's male-dominated biblical epics, where women existed primarily as romantic prizes or temptresses rather than active participants in the Exodus story. Both actresses chafed under these constraints, but had little power to expand their characters beyond DeMille's conservative vision of feminine biblical virtue versus Egyptian decadence. The Egyptian location nightmare filming The Ten Commandments in Egypt during 1954-55 subjected cast and crew to dangerous conditions that resulted in genuine casualties, serious illnesses, and near-death experiences that made the biblical plagues seem almost prophetic. The decision to shoot on location for authenticity created logistical nightmares that nearly destroyed the production. Desert heat exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit regularly, causing multiple cases of heat exhaustion, dehydration, and sun poisoning among cast and crew members wearing heavy costumes. Medical staff treated dozens of people daily for heat-related illnesses, and several crew members required hospitalization. The extreme conditions made filming schedules nearly impossible to maintain as people collapsed regularly. Managing thousands of Egyptian extras for the Exodus scenes created unprecedented challenges. Language barriers, cultural misunderstandings, and the sheer logistics of coordinating massive crowds in desert locations without modern communication technology tested production capabilities to their limits. Several extras died during filming from various causes, though exact numbers remain disputed. Political tensions from the Suez Crisis complicated filming further, as Egyptian-British-French conflicts created security concerns and diplomatic complications. The production had to navigate carefully between Egyptian authorities and their own governments while trying to complete filming before political situations deteriorated completely. The special effects revolution. The parting of the Red Sea represented 1950s cinema's most ambitious practical effect, achieved through revolutionary techniques that combined water tanks, careful photography, and optical printing in ways that had never been attempted before. Effects supervisor John P. Fulton spent over a year developing the methodology that would create the iconic image of walls of water held back by divine intervention. The technique involved filming water flowing into large tanks from opposite directions, then reversing the footage and combining it with traveling mats to create the illusion of water retreating and standing in vertical walls. This practical approach, enhanced with painted backgrounds and careful compositing, produced an effect that still convinces audiences decades later without computer assistance. The burning bush sequence required creating both visual fire effects and the overwhelming presence of God's voice without showing a physical deity. DeMille recorded his own voice for God, believing his authoritative tone appropriate for the divine, while effects artists created practical flame effects that appeared supernatural without using obvious artificial techniques. The 10 Plagues pushed special effects technology to its limits, requiring everything from artificial hail and darkness to the horrifying death of Egypt's firstborn children suggested through sound and shadow, rather than explicit imagery that would have violated censorship codes. The religious and political context. The Ten Commandments arrived during peak Cold War anxiety when American political and religious leaders were positioning Christianity as a bulwark against communist atheism. DeMille explicitly framed the film as a weapon in this ideological battle, believing biblical stories could strengthen Western resolve against Soviet influence. The Jewish Exodus story carried profound post-Holocaust resonance in 1956, just 11 years after the concentration camp's liberation. The film's depiction of enslaved people escaping genocidal tyranny to claim their promised land spoke powerfully to Jewish audiences still processing the Shoah's trauma and Israel's 1948 establishment. DeMille's conservative political agenda infused every aspect of the production. He saw the film as celebrating freedom under God versus totalitarian oppression, making Moses' rebellion against Pharaoh's tyranny a metaphor for democratic resistance to communist dictatorship. This political subtext was explicit in DeMille's promotional materials and public statements. Interfaith reactions proved complex. Christians embraced the film enthusiastically as affirming their religious heritage. Jewish leaders appreciated the respectful treatment of Hebrew scripture, but noted historical inaccuracies. Egyptian authorities were surprisingly cooperative, despite the film's portrayal of their ancestors as brutal slaveholders and obstacles to divine will. The Technicolor spectacle. The Ten Commandments was filmed in VistaVision, Paramount's widescreen format that used horizontal film movement to create unprecedented image quality and massive screen presence. This technical choice made DeMille's epic vision literally larger than life, overwhelming audiences with visual scale that television couldn't match. Technicolor cinematography transformed ancient Egypt into a riot of saturated colors that emphasized the contrast between Egyptian decadence and Hebrew austerity. The lush palaces dripped with gold, jewels, and vibrant fabrics, while the Hebrew slaves wore muted earth tones, creating visual class distinctions that reinforced the story's moral framework. Edith Head's Oscar-winning costume designs became instantly iconic, particularly the Egyptian royal garments that combined historical research with Hollywood glamour. Her costumes walked a careful line between authenticity and spectacle, creating looks that seemed plausibly ancient while remaining visually stunning by the 1950s standards. Set construction reached unprecedented scales, with ancient Egypt recreated both on Hollywood soundstages and Egyptian locations. The massive gates, towering statues, and elaborate palaces required months of construction and represented some of the most expensive set pieces ever built for cinema at that time. Behind-the-scenes power struggles. Paramount Pictures was risking potential bankruptcy by greenlighting the Ten Commandments, which became the most expensive film ever made at that point, with a budget exceeding $13 million. Studio executives watched nervously as costs spiraled, knowing that failure would potentially destroy the company, while success could secure their future for years. DeMille's total creative control was unprecedented, even by director-producer standards. He rejected all studio interference, making final decisions on every aspect of production, from casting to editing, without oversight. This autonomy reflected his legendary status, but also created enormous pressure as he alone bore responsibility for the film's artistic and commercial success. Cast resentment simmered constantly under DeMille's tyrannical direction. Actors accustomed to collaboration and respect found his dictatorial methods humiliating and exhausting. Several threatened to quit during production, but the project's scale and their contractual obligations kept them trapped in DeMille's vision regardless of personal unhappiness. The pressure to succeed affected everyone involved, from DeMille risking his final legacy to actors knowing their careers could be defined by this single role. The enormous budget and years of preparation meant that failure wasn't just disappointing, it could be professionally catastrophic for all involved. Legacy and cultural impact. The Ten Commandments' box office triumph exceeded even DeMille's optimistic projections, earning over $122 million in its initial release and becoming one of the highest-grossing films of all time when adjusted for inflation. This success vindicated DeMille's vision and proved that biblical epics could still compete commercially in modern Hollywood. Annual Easter television broadcasts created a generational viewing tradition that introduced the film to audiences who never experienced its theatrical grandeur. These broadcasts made the Ten Commandments a cultural touchstone that transcended cinema, becoming part of American religious and family traditions. Millions grew up watching Moses part the Red Sea every spring, creating shared cultural memories across decades. The film's influence on biblical epics proved enormous and lasting. Every subsequent biblical film, from Ben-Hur to The Prince of Egypt, existed in the Ten Commandments' shadow, either emulating its style or deliberately subverting its approach. DeMille's vision of how to visualize ancient religious stories became the template that dominated the genre. Historical inaccuracies were extensive and significant, from Ramesses II's actual relationship with Hebrew slaves to archaeological evidence about Exodus timing and scale. Egyptologists noted countless anachronisms and distortions, but the film's mythological power overshadowed scholarly objections and shaped popular understanding of biblical history regardless of factual accuracy. The Ten Commandments proved that sometimes the greatest spectacles require the greatest risks. DeMille didn't just make a biblical epic. He created a cinematic monument that defined how generations understood ancient faith while nearly killing himself and everyone around him in the Egyptian desert. Subscribe to discover more incredible stories behind Hollywood's most ambitious and dangerous productions.